I want you to do something for me right now.
Assuming you weren't driving, of course.
Right, assuming you aren't driving or operating heavy machinery.
Yeah.
But if you're safe to do so, close your eyes.
Just shut them for a moment.
Yeah, and I want you to actively imagine that you are staring directly into a blindingly bright light.
Like a spotlight.
Exactly. Picture a massive, overwhelming spotlight pointing right at your face. Or, the sun at absolute high noon on a cloudless day.
Try to hold that specific image.
Hold that specific intensity of luminescence in your mind. Notice the internal sensation.
Do you feel a phantom urge to squint?
Okay, now open your eyes. Welcome to today's Deep Dive. We are unpacking a remarkably elegant piece of research today.
That's a fascinating one.
It really is. We are focusing on an excerpt from a source text called The Pupils Response, Measuring the Aphantasic Mind.
And the overarching mission here for us today is to examine how researchers have managed to establish a quantifiable, objective, biological metric.
Right, for a purely subjective, completely invisible cognitive state. We're looking at the methodology behind measuring the structural realities of human imagination, specifically regarding aphantasia.
Which is, well, let's unpack this setup first.
Let's do it. Because for decades, cognitive science has struggled with this fundamental problem of phenomenology. How do you empirically prove the existence of an internal visual experience?
Or in this case, the complete absence of one.
Right. How do you prove something you can't see?
The central tension here really lies in bridging that historical gap between subjective phenomenology and objective biometrics.
Which has always been a massive headache for scientists.
Oh, absolutely. Since the inception of experimental psychology, the internal landscape of the mind has stubbornly resisted direct observation. We've had to rely on introspection.
Which is, from a rigorous methodological standpoint, that's notoriously noisy data.
Very noisy. What we are examining in the source material is a critical inflection point. The researchers aren't just looking for a vague neural correlate of imagination.
They found a physical tell.
Yes. They have identified a hardwired autonomic brainstem reflex, the pupillary light response.
The way your eye reacts to light.
Right, and they demonstrated how it maps directly onto the subjective experience of visual imagery.
We are essentially reviewing how a microscopic fluctuation in the iris can resolve a century-old methodological bottleneck in the study of consciousness.
It's a huge deal.
And for you listening, the learner, our goal today is to meticulously break down the mechanics of this study. And we want to do it without getting bogged down in, overly dexic analogy.
We already know the brain is complex.
Exactly. So we are going to get right into the specific neural circuitry that makes this phenomenon possible.
We'll critically evaluate the historical context of measuring consciousness, too.
Right. The specific methodology used to track these pupillary responses and the profound implications this has for how we classify and understand neurodivergent cognitive states like aphantasia.
Because the text immediately confronts us with a deeply entrenched scientific dilemma.
Which is, how do researchers definitively prove that an individual possesses aphantasia rather than simply possessing a different semantic interpretation of the word imagine?
To appreciate the weight of that methodological hurdle, we have to look at the history of how aphantasia has been documented.
Let's go back into the history of it.
The condition itself, which is characterized by a complete inability to voluntarily generate visual imagery in the mind's eye, it isn't a new concept.
No, it goes way back.
Right back to Francis Galton. He first described variations in visual imagery back in 1880.
The breakfast table studies.
Exactly, the breakfast table studies. He noted that many of his scientific peers reported zero visual imagery when asked to picture their morning breakfast.
Which must have been a wild realization at the time.
Yet for over a century, the field lacked the tools to do anything other than take these subjects at their word.
Trusting what they say.
Right. The primary diagnostic tool for decades has been the Vividness of Visual Imagery Questionnaire.
The VVIQ.
The VVIQ, developed in the 1970s. It asks subjects to rate the vividness of an imagined scene on a Likert scale.
But a self-reported scale introduces massive epistemological problems.
Huge problems. A rating of 1 for one participant might represent a completely different cognitive experience than a 1 for another participant.
The subjective scaling problem is a massive vulnerability in cognitive research. If we are relying on a subject's personal lexicon to describe their internal state, we're immediately introducing confounding
It's
variables.
because words are imprecise.
Exactly. If an individual with aphantasia says, "I see nothing,"
Yeah.
a skeptic could historically argue that they are simply utilizing a stricter definition of the verb to see.
Right, because a typical visualizer knows they aren't physically seeing an object.
They know it's a mental construct.
Yes.
So the skeptic argues perhaps the aphantasic is experiencing the exact same mental construct, but because it lacks the high-fidelity resolution of the physical sight, they categorize it as nothing.
It becomes a debate about language, not biology.
Exactly. How do we systematically rule out linguistic discrepancy or a fundamental misunderstanding of the task?
That exact skepticism dominated behaviorist psychology for much of the 20th century. Behaviorists argued that because internal states like imagination couldn't be independently verified, they had no place in empirical science.
If you can't measure it, it doesn't exist.
That was the mindset. Even after the cognitive revolution brought mental processes back into focus, the problem of other minds persisted.
You cannot directly access another person's subjective reality. It's like trying to convince a friend that a room is totally dark, but you're the only one allowed inside the room.
That's a great way to put it. How do you prove it to them standing outside?
You can't.
And for aphantasia, this meant the burden of proof was constantly shifted onto the individual. They had to articulate an absence.
The negative space in their cognition.
Right, to researchers who predominantly possess typical visual imagery. This disconnect highlights the absolute necessity of finding an objective biomarker.
The text emphasizes that relying on the VVIQ, while historically useful for categorizing populations, is just insufficient for establishing a definitive biological taxonomy of aphantasia.
We needed something measurable.
But I want to push back on the timeline of the methodology here for a second. We didn't just jump straight from 1970s questionnaires to measuring pupil dilation, did we?
No, of course not.
What about neuroimaging? Functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. That has been the gold standard for mapping cognitive processes for the last few decades.
It has.
So if visual imagery happens in the visual cortex, why couldn't researchers simply put someone with aphantasia in an fMRI, ask them to imagine an apple, and look for a lack of the bold D signal in the occipital lobe?
The blood oxygen level dependent signal.
Right. Wouldn't that have solved the problem of the invisible line long before we started looking at the eyes?
It's a logical assumption, but neuroimaging presents its own set of significant limitations when applied to a subjective experience like aphantasia.
Why is that?
First, fMRI relies on that bold signal, which is really just a proxy for neural activity. It measures blood flow changes that occur seconds after the actual neural firing.
So there's a lag.
A significant lag. It lacks the precise temporal resolution needed to capture the immediate, fleeting nature of a mental image.
A thought happens in a fraction of a second, but the blade flow takes several seconds to catch up.
Exactly. But more importantly, we encounter the problem of neural correlates versus actual conscious experience.
Okay, break that down for me.
Studies have shown that when individuals with aphantasia attempt to visualize, there can still be activation in frontal and parietal regions associated with cognitive effort.
Because they are trying.
Right, they are putting in the work.
Yeah.
And sometimes you even see localized activity in the visual cortex itself.
Wait, really? So the visual cortex lights up even if they don't see anything?
Sometimes, yes. However, that localized activity does not reliably translate to the conscious experience of an image.
So the brain is doing something, but it's not resulting in a picture.
The brain might be attempting to execute the subroutine, generating noise in the network. But the final rendering never materializes in consciousness.
Ah, I see. So fMRI might show the engine revving, but it can't definitively prove whether the car is actually moving in the person's subjective experience.
That's a perfect analogy.
You might see frontal lobe activation, indicating the subject is trying to comply with a task, but that doesn't resolve the phenomenological question. Does the picture exist for them?
And the fMRI data is just too noisy to serve as a definitive binary diagnostic tool for that specific question.
So what does this all mean for scientists trying to solve this? They needed a signal that was not just a proxy for effort.
They needed a direct, involuntary consequence of the visual rendering itself.
And that leads us to the eye. This is where the text pivots to the pupillary light reflex.
Yes.
The claim here is that the eyes of typical visualizers automatically constrict when they merely imagine a bright light.
Which is incredible.
We really need to break down the specific neuroanatomy of this claim, because on the surface, it seems to totally contradict the evolutionary purpose of the reflex.
The mechanism is what makes this research so compelling. Let's trace the standard biological pathway first.
Okay, let's track the hardware.
The pupillary light reflex is a subcortical autonomic loop. Under normal conditions, physical photons strike the retinal ganglion cells in your eye.
Light hits the eye.
Right. This signal travels via the optic nerve, bypassing the visual cortex entirely, and goes straight to the protectal nucleus in the midbrain.
So it doesn't even go to the thinking part of the brain.
Exactly. From there, it routes to the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, which sends parasympathetic signals down the oculomotor nerve to the sphincter pupillae muscles of the iris.
And that causes them to constrict.
Yes. This entire loop evolved purely as a mechanical defense mechanism to regulate the amount of light hitting the retina and prevent phototoxicity. It is entirely stimulus-driven, bottom-up processing.
Which makes the premise of the study highly counterintuitive.
It does.
Because if the pathway completely bypasses the visual cortex and operates as a rudimentary brainstem reflex, how can a purely cortical process—
Like imagination.
Right, the conscious top-down generation of a mental image, how can that hijack a bottom-up defense mechanism?
It's a profound question.
Evolutionarily speaking, there is no survival advantage to constricting your pupils for a light that doesn't physically exist. The metabolic energy spent adjusting the iris to a ghost stimulus seems like a biological error.
Or at least an incredibly inefficient design flaw in our neurological architecture.
Exactly.
But you're highlighting the precise reason this phenomenon is so fascinating to neuroscientists. It demonstrates the profound interconnectedness of our cognitive networks.
It's not a glitch, it's a feature.
Right. What we are observing is an override driven by top-down processing.
How does that happen?
When a typical visualizer generates a vivid mental image, the prefrontal cortex initiates the retrieval of visual memories
It pulls up the file.
and attempts to reconstruct them in the early visual cortex, specifically areas V1 and V2. The mental simulation generated by these cortical areas is so neurologically robust, so high fidelity, that it begins to bleed into the subcortical pathways.
It overflows.
Yes. The visual cortex effectively sends a cascading false signal down to the Edinger-Westphal nucleus, mimicking the sensory input of actual light.
Wow.
The brainstem cannot differentiate between the sensory data of physical photons and the high-resolution simulation generated by the cortex.
So it just reacts.
It reacts to the internal representation with the identical autonomic defense protocol it uses for physical reality.
Think about this for a second, learner.
Hmm.
If you are a visualizer and you picture a camera flash going off in your face right now, your pupils are physically shrinking in the real world. Your body is reacting to a ghost.
It implies a level of systemic integration that fundamentally challenges how we compartmentalize brain functions.
We always separate the higher cognitive functions, like imagination and abstract thought, from the lower autonomic functions, like heart rate or pupil dilation.
But this data suggests that boundary is highly permeable. The hardware of the autonomic nervous system is not isolated from the software of our daydreams.
It is actively listening to and reacting to the simulations we run in our prefrontal cortex.
Exactly.
But let's look at the methodology critically, because if I'm designing this study, my immediate concern is confounding variables.
As it should be.
The pupil doesn't just respond to light. It responds to emotional arousal, stress, and crucially, cognitive load.
Yes, cognitive load is a major factor.
When you ask someone to perform a difficult mental task, their pupils naturally dilate due to sympathetic nervous system activation.
They get wider.
Right. So how did the researchers isolate the top-down constriction caused by the imagined light from the generalized dilation caused by the effort of imagining anything at all?
That is the pivotal methodological question, and it's where the study's design demonstrates its rigor.
Walk me through it.
To isolate the specific variable of imagined luminescence, the researchers had to employ highly controlled comparative conditions.
They needed a baseline.
Exactly. They didn't simply ask subjects to imagine a bright light and measure the raw change. They asked subjects to imagine objects of varying luminance.
Like what?
For example, imagining a bright sunny sky versus a dark, dimly lit room. Crucially, they measured the difference in pupillary response between these two distinct mental tasks.
Oh, that's smart. Because the cognitive load required to imagine a dark room is roughly equivalent to the cognitive load required to imagine a bright sky.
Exactly. Therefore, the sympathetic dilation caused by mental effort remains relatively constant across both conditions.
So they established a baseline of cognitive effort. By subtracting the response to the dark imagined object from the response to the bright imagined object, Any residual difference can only be attributed to the specific internal representation of luminance.
That is exactly the math they did.
If the pupil size is smaller when imagining the bright object compared to the dark object, the only variable responsible for that constriction is the content of the visual imagery itself.
Overriding that baseline dilation of cognitive load.
That is an incredibly elegant way to filter out the noise of the sympathetic nervous system. It isolates the parasympathetic response, triggered specifically by the visual cortex.
Precisely the methodology. Furthermore, the researchers utilized high-resolution infrared eye tracking technology.
They weren't just eyeballing it.
No, they were sampling the pupil diameter hundreds of times per second. This wasn't a matter of simple observation.
It was a collection of massive, highly granular data sets.
Data that would map the microfluctuations of the iris over the exact duration of the visualization task. They also tightly controlled the physical environment.
They'd have to.
The physical room luminance was kept completely constant, ensuring that the bottom-up, photon-driven reflex was neutralized.
So any change in the pupil was entirely generated internally.
Yes, this rigorous control environment sets the stage for the critical divergence observed in subjects with aphantasia.
Which brings us to the core finding of the text. This raises an important question. If this happens for visualizers, what is the physical response when the imagination is invisible?
And the source explicitly states that the eyes of those with aphantasia do not constrict when imagining a bright light.
They just don't do it.
No, we need to dissect the implications of this absence of response.
Because it's huge.
When an individual with aphantasia is instructed to imagine the bright sun, we know they comprehend the instruction. They possess the semantic knowledge of what the sun is.
They know it's bright. They know its properties.
And its association with intense light. They are actively engaging their prefrontal cortex to access that conceptual data.
Yet the subcortical reflex remains entirely dormant.
The pupillary response to the imagined bright object is statistically indistinguishable from their response to the imagined dark object.
Let's analyze the neurology behind that flatline data. The absence of the pupillary reflex confirms the phenomenological report at a biological level.
It proves what they've been saying all along.
Because the individual with aphantasia lacks the capacity to render the mental image in the early visual cortex.
Because there is no top-down simulation of luminance being generated in V1 and V2.
Right. There is no false sensory signal to cascade down to the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. The brainstem receives no instruction to initiate the parasympathetic constriction.
The biological hardware is functioning perfectly. It simply isn't receiving the specific software input required to trigger the reflex.
Picture this scene. Two people sitting in a pitch-black room. Both are asked to vividly imagine looking at the noon sun.
Okay.
One person's eyes react wildly to the dark, constricting. The other person's eyes remain totally unchanged. It's a silent, invisible difference made entirely visible.
A very striking image.
But let's play devil's advocate regarding the experimental design.
Always a good idea.
If an individual self-reports having aphantasia and they sit in the lab, and their pupils show zero difference between the bright and dark conditions,
A deeply entrenched skeptic might still ask something.
they'd ask, how do we know the aphantasic subjects weren't simply failing to perform the task? What if they just sat there and didn't even try to think about the concepts?
Right, because if they exert zero cognitive effort, they would produce zero pupillary change.
Exactly. How does the objective data prove they were actively participating in the cognitive exercise?
That is where the metric of cognitive load we discussed earlier becomes the definitive proof of concept.
Ah, the dilation.
Yes. The researchers didn't just look for constriction. They monitored the overall pupil dynamics.
What did they see?
When the individuals with aphantasia were given the prompt to imagine the scenarios, the eye tracking data showed the characteristic pupillary dilation associated with cognitive effort.
Their pupils widened.
They widened, confirming via sympathetic nervous system activation that they were actively engaging with the task,
Processing the semantics.
exerting mental energy to recall the spatial and factual properties of the objects.
That is the critical data point. The dilation proves the mental effort is present, but the lack of relative constriction proves the visual rendering is absent.
The effort is there, but the phenomenological output is different.
It entirely dismantles the argument that individuals with aphantasia are just lazy visualizers or that they misunderstand the task.
The data captures the exact moment the cognitive process diverges.
Both groups hear the prompt. Both groups exert measurable mental effort to access the concept. But only the typical visualizers generate the sensory simulation capable of triggering the brainstem override.
It fundamentally shifts the paradigm of how we validate subjective experience.
I can't help but think about how validating this must be.
For the individual with aphantasia, absolutely.
Having no physical pupil constriction isn't a deficit. Rather, it is the exact appropriate physical response to their unique internal reality.
Because their body is perfectly aligned with their mind.
For the individual with aphantasia, the lack of pupil constriction is not a malfunction of the ocular system. It is a highly accurate, perfectly calibrated biological reflection of their internal cognitive environment.
If the mental workspace is devoid of visual luminance, the autonomic nervous system correctly maintains the baseline aperture of the pupil.
The internal state and the external biomarker are in perfect alignment.
It removes the necessity for the subject to defend their internal reality using imprecise language. The biology provides an unassailable, objective record.
We have to consider the emotional and psychological validation this provides for the neurodivergent community.
It's massive.
Imagine spending your entire life in an educational and social system built entirely around the assumption of visual imagery.
Where instructions constantly involve, picture this, visualize your goal, or imagine the scene.
Right. The friction of constantly translating a conceptually semantic mind into a visually oriented world must be exhausting.
And historically, when trying to explain this fundamental difference, they were met with skepticism from the scientific community itself.
From the people who are supposed to be studying them objectively. Providing a hard, incontrovertible biological metric does more than just solve a research problem.
It legitimizes a minority cognitive profile.
It firmly establishes aphantasia not as a psychological curiosity, but as a verified structural variance in human neurobiology.
The broader implications for cognitive science are what make this study a true watershed moment.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We started with the problem of proving the invisible mind, and here is the exact mechanism that does it.
The source material emphasizes that this phenomenon provides an objective measure of an internal experience.
By isolating this specific biomarker, researchers have created a template for how we might investigate other invisible cognitive states.
We are no longer solely dependent on the VVIQ or the limitations of fMRI bold signals.
We have a direct, real-time, high-resolution readout of a specific type of mental simulation. It's like a biological dashboard indicator for the imagination.
This opens up entirely new avenues for research. For instance, can we use this same methodology to measure the precise degree of vividness in hyperphantasia?
Remind us what hyperphantasia is.
It's the condition of having exceptionally vivid, almost hallucinatory mental imagery.
That raises a fascinating variable. If the degree of pupil constriction correlates directly with the self-reported vividness of the image, we could theoretically map an entire spectrum of human imagination.
We could measure whether a hyperphantastic individual's pupils constrict significantly more than a typical visualizer's when given the identical prompt.
We could quantify the intensity of the internal simulation.
And what about changes over time? We know that trauma, cognitive decline, or certain neurological events can alter a person's ability to visualize.
Could this pupillary test be used as a non-invasive diagnostic tool to track the degradation or recovery of the visual cortex networks?
It transforms the eye from a simple sensory organ into a diagnostic window for the cortex.
Looking at the methodology, we must also consider the potential applications for studying other subjective phenomena. If top-down visual simulation can hijack the pupillary light reflex.
Do other internal sensory simulations trigger corresponding autonomic responses?
Exactly. What about auditory imagination? Does internally simulating a sudden, deafening sound trigger the stapedius reflex in the middle ear?
The tiny muscle that contracts to dampen loud physical noises.
Right. If I imagine a loud explosion, does that muscle flex?
Yeah.
What about internally simulating extreme cold?
Can we measure microfluctuations and localized vascular constriction when a subject vividly imagines submerging their hand in ice water?
The framework established by this research suggests that our autonomic nervous system is far more responsive to our internal narratives than we previously understood.
The idea that our internal monologues and mental simulations are constantly tweaking our baseline autonomic states is profound.
It bridges the gap between the software of consciousness and the hardware of biology in a way that feels incredibly tangible. But we also have to remain critical of the limitations of this specific objective measure.
We do.
While the pupillary reflex successfully differentiates between the presence and absence of visual imagery regarding luminance, it doesn't give us the full picture of the aphantasic mind.
No, it doesn't.
Aphantasia isn't just the lack of a visual screen, it's a completely different structural approach to data retrieval.
If they aren't using visual representation, they are relying heavily on spatial awareness, semantic networks, and conceptual logic.
Does this study run the risk of reducing a complex cognitive profile down to a single missing reflex?
That is a crucial nuance to maintain. Biomarkers are invaluable for validation and categorization, but they are not comprehensive descriptions of consciousness.
The lack of pupil constriction proves the absence of visual imagery.
But it tells us very little about the alternative neural pathways the aphantasic brain utilizes to achieve the same functional outcome.
We know that individuals with aphantasia perform equally well in many working memory and spatial reasoning tasks.
They simply use a different encoding strategy. The danger of relying solely on a negative biomarker, measuring what isn't happening, is that we might neglect to investigate the compensatory mechanisms that are happening.
The objective measure proves the divergence, but it is only the first step in mapping the divergent territory itself.
We have to view this not as the end of the inquiry, but as the establishment of a rigorous baseline.
Now that we have a scientifically unassailable method for identifying the populations, we can conduct much more precise neuroimaging studies to map those alternative pathways you mentioned.
If we take a cohort verified by the pupillary test and analyze their fMRI data during spatial reasoning tasks,
We can begin to see exactly how the semantic and spatial networks compensate for the lack of visual rendering.
the pupillary reflex isn't the whole story, but it is the key that finally unlocks the door to rigorous empirical study of the condition without the noise of subjective reporting.
Furthermore, this methodology provides a powerful tool for investigating the developmental timeline of aphantasia.
That's a great point. Is it a congenital structural difference present from birth, or does the ability to visualize degrade during early childhood development?
By utilizing an objective, non-invasive measure like eye tracking, researchers could theoretically test visual imagery in much younger populations.
Kids who may not yet possess the metacognitive language skills required to accurately answer a VVIQ questionnaire.
You could track the pupillary responses of children over time, identifying exactly when and how the visual imagery networks diverge.
This could provide vital insights into the plasticity of the brain and the development of distinct cognitive styles.
That developmental aspect is incredibly compelling. If we can track the neurological divergence objectively, we can begin to unravel the genetic or environmental factors that contribute to it.
But I want to circle back to the core philosophical tension we discussed at the beginning, the problem of other minds.
For centuries, philosophers have debated whether we can ever truly know that the color red I experience is the same color red you experience.
This concept of qualia.
The subjective conscious experience of a sensory input. It has been considered the hard problem of consciousness, forever beyond the reach of physical measurement.
Does finding a physical biomarker for imagination bring us any closer to solving the hard problem? Or does it merely map the plumbing without explaining the water?
It's an essential philosophical distinction. The discovery of this biomarker does not solve the hard problem of consciousness.
It does not explain how neural firing translates into the subjective feeling of an image.
However, it significantly narrows the explanatory gap.
By proving that specific internal states have distinct, quantifiable, and non-voluntary physical correlates, we anchor the ethereal concept of qualia firmly into the physical world.
It rejects the epiphenomenalist view that consciousness is just a useless byproduct of the brain, hovering above the physical machinery without interacting with it.
The fact that the conscious simulation of light physically moves the muscles of the iris proves that subjective experience has causal power in the physical biological system.
The causal power of thought. That is the ultimate takeaway from this methodology.
It's not just that the mind reflects reality. The mind creates a reality that the body is forced to respond to.
When we look at the entire scope of what we've unpacked today,
Mm.
it's remarkable how a single specific study can ripple out to challenge our foundational assumptions about human biology.
We started with the immense frustration of trying to measure the invisible, the reliance on flawed self-reporting, and the limitations of multi-million-dollar neuroimaging machines.
And the solution wasn't found in a more complex brain scan.
It was found by observing a primal subcortical reflex that evolution designed millions of years ago.
And realizing that our highly evolved abstract imaginations were quietly hacking that system.
The elegance of the science lies in its simplicity. By observing the pupillary light reflex, researchers bypass the noise of human language
They bypass the proxy data of blood flow,
and directly observe the physiological footprint of a thought. It provides an undeniable biological validation for individuals with aphantasia.
proving that their internal experience is a genuine structural variance, not a semantic misunderstanding.
It establishes a rigorous objective measure for a phenomenon that has eluded empirical science for over a century.
It is a profound shift in how we approach the study of the mind. And for you, the learner, as you absorb the mechanics of this research, I highly encourage you to carry this awareness with you today.
Consider the immense unseen power of your own cognitive simulations.
Every memory you recall, every future scenario you plan, every abstract concept you visualize is generating a cascade of highly specific, localized biological reactions throughout your nervous system.
You are constantly rewriting your physiological state with your internal narrative.
As we conclude our analysis of this remarkable intersection between subjective phenomenology and objective biology, I will leave you with a final overarching question to consider.
Given that our autonomic brainstem networks process high-fidelity mental simulations with the exact same biological urgency as physical external reality,
Does the human organism actually possess a hardwired mechanism to differentiate between the physical world we inhabit and the complex, invisible worlds we continuously build within our own minds?